It is my pleasure to introduce to you tonight Ward Gasque. Dr. Gasque has dedicated his life to making theology accessible. He's a graduate of Wheaton College, Fuller Theological Seminary, and received his PhD from Manchester University. He's also written a number of books, commentaries, and essays. You will also have access to one of his articles later this evening. Dr. Gasque has served in a variety of academic leadership positions, including visiting scholar at Princeton Theological Seminary and adjunct professor of New Testament at Fuller Theological Seminary of the Northwest. He's currently president of the Pacific Association of Theological Studies and founder of the Center for Innovation in Theological Education in Seattle. He and his wife live on an island off of Vancouver. And it is my pleasure to welcome him up. Please help me welcome Dr. Ward Gasque.
Thank you very much. It's good being with you. I might move this up slightly to talk to you about the Da Vinci Code. Now, obviously, it's fiction because it is a novel. On the other hand, a lot of people seem to miss that point, and we're going to talk about that tonight. Here's Dan Brown, the author of the Da Vinci Code. He's a graduate of Amherst College and Phillips Exeter School in New England, where he taught English until he decided to be a writer. He was doing graduate studies. As he looked forward to a career as an academic, it dawned on him it was a lot more fun writing novels, and so he started writing them, and he wrote 3 novels before the Da Vinci Code, and they had moderately successful sales, 5,000-10,000 copies each. And if you've published a book, that's pretty good. But then along comes the Da Vinci Code. And here he hits the big time. 35 million copies plus, and it hasn't come into paperback in North America yet. It's absolutely amazing. It is the phenomenal best-selling novel of all times in terms of that time spread. 2.5 years it's been out. Ever since its first week, it has been on the New York Times bestseller list for hardback fiction, and it is still on that list. Depending on which bestseller list you look at, he's on all of them. The Publishers Week bestseller list for this week lists him number 10 on the hardback fiction, which is quite a ways down, but there must be several new books came out, and he'll be back up the list later. And these other books that only sold 5,000 or 10,000 copies have now sold over 1 million each, and the Angels and Demons volume, which is sort of a companion piece in one sense to the Da Vinci Code, has sold 3 or 4 million, I think, at the moment. There he is, I think, enjoying the life of a writer. I tell my students, if you want to be a writer, don't quit your day job yet, because you're not likely to be Dan Brown, but we keep hoping. It's just like winning the lottery. How many have read the book, Da Vinci Code? Okay, there's probably 60%, 70% of you. That's great. The characters: Jacques Charnier, the curator of the Louvre, expert in Renaissance art. As it turns out, he has been a leader of the so-called Priory of Sion. Turns out to be a secret society designed to keep the truth alive about the origins of Christianity and this sort of thing. It's quite different from what you've heard. Robert Langdon is professor of religious symbology at Harvard. Is there a professor of religious symbology at Harvard? Not yet. I'm sure that the development department has their eyes on Dan Brown endowing such a chair. Captain Bezu Fache of the Paris Police Department, a typical lieutenant or captain out to solve a crime, comes on as a bumbling person, but as time develops, he's smarter than he appears. Sophie Neveu, a cryptologist, an expert in codes. And Dan Brown's, all of his books have to do with codes. He's got a new one coming out, by the way, probably shortly after the movie comes out on the Da Vinci Code, which is scheduled now for May 19th, 2006. And his new book is going to be the Solomon Key. And surprise, it's about the Masons and other sorts of intrigue. Well, Sophie Neveu happens to be the estranged granddaughter of Jacques Chaunaire. She's got red hair. That's significant. Sophie, that name mean anything to you? Greek for wisdom. Neveu, the new Eve, maybe. Silas the monk, he's about my size, but he's an albino. I don't know how they're going to do this in the movie because it's not politically correct to do it the way they did it in the book. But anyway, there he is. He's a monk, a member of Opus Dei. Opus Dei don't actually have monks, but who knows? Maybe there is a monk somewhere that has involved in the Opus Dei organization. And then there's Bishop Manuel Aringarosa, who is the head of Opus Dei, the Catholic secret movement, and Sir Lee Teabing, the British royal historian. I haven't found out yet if there is one, but in any case, it makes a good read. The plot is that Chaunaire is murdered in the Louvre. As it turns out, he's one of 4 people murdered that very day by, guess who? The monk. He leaves clues as he is dying. He has about 20 minutes to leave these clues, and he leaves them in code for Sophie, his granddaughter, and Langdon, who he knew would be on the scene. He had an appointment with Langdon, but it wasn't really kept, and so Langdon becomes a prime suspect in the case. And this all leads to a merry chase around Paris and environs, and eventually to London, and also a brief trip to Edinburgh, all within about 30 hours of time. Very fast moving, to say the least. This is the entrance to the Louvre, the modern entrance, La Pyramide, designed by I.M. Pei, the Chinese-American distinguished architect, said to have, according to the Da Vinci Code, 666 panes of glass. Does that seem significant to you? Someone actually contacted I.M. Pei's office and said, how many panes of glass are there in that pyramid? And they said, according to our records, there's actually 687, which damages the theory a little bit. But in any case, what if it was 666? Would it make any difference? Anyway, this is the new stunning entrance to the Louvre. Lots of people, when this was first built and opened, made fun of it, and now everybody likes it, or virtually everybody. And here we are taking a walk through the Louvre. There are literally thousands and thousands of great works of art in display in this great museum. It's said that the average American tourist who visits the Louvre spends at least an hour and 15 minutes seeing all those great works of art, and stops especially at the really famous works of art along the way. One of them is Winged Victory, famous statue. And they spend about a minute and a half seeing this as they go by. And here we're moving through the museum, the great halls, and we're coming towards the most famous work in the Louvre, the Mona Lisa. People are lining up to see this beautiful, historic, important portrait. You can see why people don't stay too long, because if you stay very long, the person behind you says, come on, I want to see it as well. So there you go. Eventually you get to see this striking portrait. Why is she smiling? This is the world's most famous portrait. It's also the most reproduced by important artists such as Marcel Duchamp, Andy Warhol, and Jasper Johns, as well as by lots of unknown or lesser known artists along the way. It embodies the Renaissance artistic discoveries of perspective. Things changed about the way portraits were done at this particular time in history. It has a new view of anatomy and composition. It seems that prior to this time in history, most people that painted portraits didn't actually look that carefully at the people. They actually looked at other portraits. Leonardo is representative of a new generation of artists who decide to actually look at people, including naked human bodies and corpses and other things, so that he could get things right. And also they learned a new way of looking at that we today call perspective, and it really is quite different from anything before. And Leonardo sets a standard for Renaissance portraiture. Note the use of perspective with all the lines converging on a single vanishing point behind Mona Lisa's head, and the triangular composition. Prior to this, portraits were stiff, flat, and more than a little dull. Leonardo changed portrait painting forever. Note the smile. Why is she smiling? Well, Leonardo is said to have hired musicians to play for people while he was doing their portraits. Maybe that's why she's smiling. Look at her eyes. Look at her hands. You never saw hands or eyes like that in any portraiture prior to about 1500 AD. Napoleon hung this portrait in his bedroom until it was returned to the Louvre in 1804. Who is this woman? Mona? Mona is an abbreviation for Italian Madonna or Mrs. Lisa, obviously a woman's name, presumably her first name or Christian name. The majority opinion is that she's the young wife of a Florentine businessman by the name of Francesco del Giocondo. That's what most art historians believe. The rest of the art historical world would say, we're not sure exactly who she was. No art historians that I have identified yet quite agree that she is who the Da Vinci Code suggests that she is. This is the famous Vitruvian Man by Leonardo. It's designed to illustrate an important essay on human proportion written by a first century Roman architect engineer by the name of Vitruvius. Jacques Charnier had recreated this image, the Vitruvian Man, by his body before his death. He had about 20 minutes because he had triggered a mechanism that protected him from the killer, would-be killer, coming in and finishing off quickly, so he's able to leave certain clues. So one of the things he did was to take his clothes off and to end up dying on the floor in a circle painted in his own blood, and having a little star that we call a pentacle or a pentagram, a five-pointed star that today in popular culture is identified with Wicca or Satanism, but historically had a lot of different meanings. In the Christian tradition, the pentagram or pentacle is a symbol of the 5 wounds of Christ. In early Chinese, pre-Christian Chinese science, it's simply an astronomical symbol, and there are lots of other meanings that it has in various types of culture. But in any case, to make this story more interesting, it obviously has some sort of pagan symbol in the story, but it's different from the sort of negative popular idea of Satan worship and so on that we have today. He also leaves little codes written again in his own blood in other places so that Sophie and Robert Langdon can find out the truth about what has happened. One of the things that Charnier did was grab a Caravaggio painting and tear it off the wall, and that triggered the mechanism that caused an iron gate to fall down and protect him and give him that 20 minutes to leave those clues. We don't know if this is the Caravaggio that Dan Brown had in mind, but it's not all that far away, and it's one of a number of Caravaggios in the Louvre. Here's Leonardo da Vinci himself as a young man. He's the person who really gave the meaning to the term Renaissance man. An amazing person. He personified the ideal of the Renaissance man. He's a painter, a sculptor, an architect, engineer, inventor, scientist, creative genius. He was universally admired for his handsome appearance, his brilliant intellect and charm. Tall, with long blonde hair and a beard, he's described by a contemporary as a person, quote, whose every movement was grace itself, and whose abilities were so extraordinary that he could readily solve every difficulty. And if that was not enough, Leonardo could sing divinely, and his conversation won all hearts. He observed everything carefully and kept sketches in his notebooks: humans, animals, machines, geography. He was one of the first moderns to make a careful study of human anatomy by the use of cadavers. He was a superb idea man, but he wasn't really all that great on the follow-through. Most of his works that he started, he never really completed. It's sort of like students not completing their essays and so on. Some people are good at starting and others are good at finishing, and those that finish get the degrees. Well, Leonardo was very good at getting commissions, and that kept his enterprise going. But he would run out of money and work on other commissions and not really follow them through. So in spite of the fact that the Da Vinci Code refers to thousands of works by Leonardo, actually there's less than 100 in total, and probably no more than a dozen or so that were actually completely finished by Leonardo. Having said that, he is one of the most influential artists in history. By the way, his name is Leonardo. It's not Da Vinci. Da Vinci is the name of the town that he came from, Vinci. He's from Vinci. Calling Leonardo Da Vinci, as in Da Vinci Code, is sort of like calling Jesus of Nazareth. Nazareth is where Jesus came from. Vinci is where Leonardo came from. His name that art historians would call him is Leonardo. Here he is as an older man. I used to say old man until I realized he was about the age that I am when he died. This was done, a self-portrait, done shortly before his death at the age of 67. He died in France, where he had been summoned and given a pension, very generous pension, by the King of France, King Francis I, so that if the king got tired of all the sycophants surrounding him, telling him what he wanted to hear, he could go talk with somebody who really was smart and could carry on an intelligent conversation. So that was his contribution to the society where he lived, was to provide some good conversation for the king from time to time. In any case, he continued his work as he always had done, and did a number of arts there as well. The Da Vinci Code suggests a number of things about Leonardo. First of all, that he was a homosexual. The fact is that he, along with 3 or 4 other young men, was accused anonymously but publicly of homosexual behavior, and this was brought to a local court concerned with morals of youth and others in society, but it was thrown out twice because there was no witness. No one was willing to come and put his name to this charge. And you could argue that it may have been intended to embarrass someone else other than Leonardo. Leonardo was not a member of a prominent Florentine family. The other young men involved in the accusation were, and they are probably more likely to have enemies who wanted to get them in trouble. But in any case, it was tossed out. Now, having said that, that is the evidence for Leonardo being homosexual. There are some quotes from his notebooks and writings that are said to make it very clear that he was homosexual, but I've read those writings and I'd say, well, maybe he was more attracted to males than females sexually. I don't really know, but there's no proof that that is true. There's no actual historical evidence of that. He was certainly not a blatant homosexual, as Dan Brown suggests in the book. Secondly, it suggested that he was not a Christian. Well, he was not a very good Christian, but there's no evidence that he actually thumbed his nose to the Christian faith or denied the Christian faith. Particularly, he didn't always live up to the standards of the faith, but he was a professing believer, not very faithful in church attendance and so on. But at the end of his life, he did ask for final rites from the church, and there's no suggestion that this was somehow forced upon him. He was born out of wedlock. He was always hurt by the fact that his father had not really acknowledged him, and he sort of felt a little bit abused by his father, but loved by his mother, a peasant woman. So this was the source of a burden to him. Thirdly, it suggested that he was the grand master of this organization, which allegedly was founded in the 11th century AD, called the Priory of Sion. Well, there's no evidence at all that he had anything to do with any secret society of any kind, but not one of this particular name and setting in Florence. In fact, there's no evidence that this organization actually did exist until the I think about 60s or so, when it was started as a religious non-profit organization in France by a man with a criminal record who was clearly into fraud. And some documents were slipped into the National Library of France, some fraudulent documents giving all the evidence for this shadowy organization, which only really existed in the 20th century. The founder of this organization is gone, and as far as we can tell, there are no active people involved in it today, but we don't know. In any case, there's no evidence that this organization went back historically into the Middle Ages and Renaissance and so on. Fourth, it suggested that Leonardo's painted paintings that included veiled attacks on Christianity or the proclamation of an earlier pagan understanding of religion and morals and so on. Again, there's no evidence of this. We'll look at some of his key paintings, but there's no evidence of this that would be recognized by art historians. Yes, some of his painting, like all art, has symbols and is you have to interpret it and so on, but they're not hidden anti-Christian symbols as far as any art historians have observed. Fifth, that his notebooks were written in code to keep what he was writing secret, so that because it was explosive and it was controversial, it would be attacked by people. Well, there's every evidence that Leonardo wanted people to read his notebooks, that he was really writing to the public. It's hard to explain why he didn't arrange for them to be disseminated, either before his death or after his death and so on. And he didn't. It was sort of divided up among his friends, and they've only come up in modern times. But they're not written in code. You can read them if you can do two things. One, it's helpful to know Italian, because they're written in Italian. They occasionally use abbreviations, shorthand, but not really in code. So you have to know Italian to read them. Secondly, if you can read mirror image text, that is to say, it's like, remember the old-fashioned hot type, metal type, that used to be, I had a friend whose father worked at the newspaper office, and I used to go over and they'd pour this type, and my friend's father used to set the type, and he could proofread the type in mirror image. And I could never even read it, much less proofread it in mirror image. But if you spend a little time, you can do this. I once met in, I think it was the 450th anniversary of Cambridge University Press in Cambridge, England, their celebration, and we were showing off all the technology, and in that time, you still had hot type. You're just on the phase of phasing out hot type for the modern type that we have, type set by computers. And I met a young man who was not a university graduate, so fresh out of high school, but he had learned the trade of printing, and he could read the mirror image text, proofread, in about 16 or 17 languages. So it's something you can learn to do. So if you've ever been to a museum that has Leonardo's notebooks, or if a sort of a display is brought your way, you will see people bringing big mirrors and holding them up so they can read them. Now, easier way than that is you can just go to the library and you can check out books that will give you photographic reproduction of his notebooks. He wrote about 15,000 pages in his notebooks. He made notes on everything. And there's no hidden coded material there, and it's not all that controversial, except that Leonardo was a very creative person, and he's basically writing his thoughts down and some of his creative projects and so on. Well, here's the Virgin of the Rocks. It's in the Louvre today, one version of a picture telling the story, the legendary story from one of the apocryphal Gospels of Jesus and his mother, and Joseph, who's not in the picture, stopping off in a cave in the wilderness of Judea on his way to Egypt, fleeing the wrath of Herod the Great. And in the book, the Vinci Code, those of you who've read it will remember this angel is supposed to be pointing sinisterly at Jesus, who would be the little guy over here. And this is supposed to be John the Baptist pointing again, threatening towards Jesus. Actually, this little guy over here is John the Baptist. And this person happens to be the baby Jesus. And the angel is not particularly threatening, but Jesus and the angel are pointing toward John the Baptist, saying, in effect, listen to him. And what's the little baby John the Baptist, who was a cousin of Jesus, saying? 6 months older. Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. If you look at this next version, a later version of the same painting, adapted a little differently, is hanging in the National Gallery of London today. You can see the staff that John the Baptist is holding. It makes it very clear that this is John the Baptist, and also he's got a sort of a girdle of fur around his chest, which again is the symbol of John the Baptist in the book of the New Testament, in the Gospel according to Matthew, and so on. So nothing really all that sinister about this. It's simply an account of a legendary stop on the way down into Egypt. Jesus and the Holy Family fleeing for their lives, according to the New Testament. Here's the Église Saint-Sulpice in Paris. Part of the story takes place here. You can visit there today, and it's more crowded than it usually is. Tourists coming through, 2/3 of them with copies of the Da Vinci Code under their arm. And they come up to the priest and they say, tell us where this took place in that place. And the priest says, this church has nothing really to do with this book, and what you've read is mistaken. And people sort of shake their head in disbelief and say, well, we know what you're trying to hide. Why has this book been such a powerful bestseller? Well, perhaps this has something to do with it. Rumors of this conspiracy. Americans love conspiracy, and evidently not just Americans, people all over the world. Been whispered for centuries in countless languages. Well, you could probably count them if necessary, but including languages of art, music, and literature. Some of the most dramatic evidence can be found in the paintings of Leonardo da Vinci, which seems to overflow with mystifying symbols, anomalies, and codes. Art historians agree that da Vinci's paintings contain hidden levels of meaning. Well, Dan Brown's wife is an art historian, and Dan took some courses in art history in Spain. There may be one or two other friends, and that would be probably the limit of the art historians who would take this approach. Many scholars believe that his work intentionally provides clues to a powerful secret, a secret that remains protected to this day by a clandestine brotherhood of which da Vinci was a member. Well, that gives you a hint of what lies in the background. Does Dan Brown really believe this? He's given only 2 or 3 interviews since he's published this book. It gives you the impression that he doesn't want to be dogmatic about it and to say that these so-called alternative historical theories are really definitely true, but he says more or less, I was skeptical when I began investigating, and then when I thought about it, it seemed to me that, well, they may be just very well be true. At least they're as credible as the traditional explanations and so on. Here's the headquarters in New York of Opus Dei. Yes, it exists, ladies and gentlemen, and that is its headquarters, and that's about the evidence for the Opus Dei conspiracy. That much is true. Mona Lisa, again, why is she smiling? Is she smiling because this is really Leonardo in drag? This is really a Leonardo as a hermaphrodite, a perfect blend of female and male, the blending together the ideal feminine divine and natural male humanity, and so on. Well, that's the thought. This is Leonardo's famous picture of the Last Supper. This is in the monastery, a Dominican monastery of Mary of Grace in Milano, outside of Milano. The top material up here, that's all late, had nothing to do with Leonardo. This picture here, basically of the people around the table, as Leonardo. This is not a fresco, as Dan Brown refers to it, but it's rather on canvas that is attached with gesso and mastic and other materials to the plaster. Leonardo would not have painted on wet plaster because he worked slowly. You know, if you're going to do a fresco, which is painted into wet plaster, you can't really take weeks and weeks and weeks to do it. The plaster will dry. So because he really didn't work that way, he did it on canvas, and the canvas was affixed to the wall. It's actually done with temper on stone with a heavy base of gesso, pitch, and mastic, so my art historian wife tells me. It began to deteriorate almost from its inception. There were numerous attempts down through history to restore it, and all of them, but the most recent one, made it worse. Dampness, damage by the doorway. Notice down here at the bottom, there's a sort of an archway here. That's because some abbot got tired of walking about 100 feet around to the other side of the building, but wanted to come into the refectory. This is in a dining room, refectory, in a monastery, and wanted to come straight into the refectory, and so they cut a hole in the wall, including this famous painting. It's now been sealed up, but that part of the painting is missing. This is so-called Last Supper. Who are these people? Well, Leonardo doesn't leave us in doubt. He actually has a diagram or a sketch of this in his notebooks, and he gives you their names, starting from left to right. There is Bartholomew. There is James the Less. There's Andrew. There's Peter, his brother. And this little guy that seems smaller and a little bit dark around the face is Judas. In some of the earlier pictures of the Last Supper and later ones, Judas is on the other side of the table. He can't really be on this side of the altar. But in Leonardo's picture, Judas is right there on that side. And then there's this, who is this woman? 1, 2, 3, 12 apostles, and one of them is a woman? Huh. Come back to her, or him, or what? Jesus obviously in the middle, and in Renaissance, high Renaissance perspective, the focal point, in spite of what you've read in the Da Vinci Code about an imaginary M being there, is actually out the window behind Jesus. This is classic Renaissance perspective there. Jesus is central in this picture, and it's what it's all about. And then you go on beyond Jesus. There's Thomas. He's the guy with his finger pointed upwards, doubting Thomas. Lord, is it I? James, the brother of John, is the next person. Philip, Matthew, Jude, and the final guy is Simon the Zealot. Is this a woman? And if so, is this Mary Magdalene, the disciple of Jesus? How many of you think this looks like a woman? Don't be embarrassed. Go ahead. Okay. How many of you who think that have had a course in Renaissance art? Okay. In Leonardo's notebook, this happens to be John, the beloved disciple, mentioned in the Gospel of John and also one of the 12 disciples. Why does he look so effeminate? Well, if you look at Renaissance art of the period and you see pictures of young students, males, all, or apprentices, that's what they look like. This is an idealized young apprentice or disciple or students in Renaissance Florence of the time of Leonardo, beginning of the 16th century. This is what they looked like. The illustrated edition of the Da Vinci Code has 3 pictures where you have an effeminate-looking young disciple, one of them by Albert Dürer. He's going to sleep, or she's going to sleep. The book says clearly, here are 3 pictures of women at the Last Supper among Jesus' disciples. No art historian that I'm aware in Renaissance art would actually concur with that. Nor has anyone in antiquity ever made the suggestion. It's only a very, very recent suggestion, and it's plausible only to those who really don't know a lot about the history and the art of the period. This picture, by the way, is not about the institution of the Lord's Supper. It's the moment in the narrative when Jesus basically says, one of you who is partaking of this food with me, sitting around this table, is going to betray me. It's that moment that Leonardo has captured. And the disciples are shocked and responding, no, is it I? That's what's on the picture. That's why the institution of the Lord's Supper is not the subject matter. It's basically about Jesus and his relationship to disciples, and particularly the coming betrayal of Jesus. Now, I don't have a slide that shows you the dagger that there is sort of behind the back of Peter, who is talking to John, or is it Mary Magdalene? But there's a dagger there, and that suggested that, well, there's something sinister going on. Maybe it's Peter who's going to stab Mary Magdalene, maybe, because he's jealous, or something strange is going to happen. It's suggested that the actually arm and the dagger are disembodied. But in actual fact, it seems to be Peter's hands. Now, if you've read the gospel story, you will know there is a mention in the Passion narrative of a dagger. And who had it? Peter. And what did he do with it? He chopped off the high priest's servant's ear, and Jesus healed it. Now, is there something symbolic about that? That's really part of the narrative. And why is it so strange? It's sort of awkward, sort of his arms are crossed like this while he's holding his dagger. Is that symbolic of anything? Do you know the subsequent tradition about Peter? Does this say anything to you symbolically? He too was crucified. He too was crucified. So he was, in spite of this time of challenge and even denial, that little symbol is probably referring to his coming crucifixion as well. Well, here's Mary Magdalene, and as you know, Mary Magdalene is fairly important in this story. It is said that although the New Testament celebrates her or identifies her as the first witness to the resurrection of Jesus and one who brought this message to the disciples, that somehow she's been erased from the story. Well, in actual fact, all four Gospels underline the fact that she was the first witness to the resurrection, and that's why she's called in early Christian tradition as the apostle to the apostles of God, the one who is sent to the ones who are sent, the original apostles, with this story. So the New Testament actually does celebrate her as a witness to the resurrection. And the idea that somehow she's been suppressed doesn't really follow very well, because if you take after Peter and Paul and Mary, the mother of Jesus, you probably have more churches around the world named for Mary Magdalene than anybody else. Now, I haven't done a scientific analysis of that, but there may be another more popular name, but there are lots of them, and this is one of the more famous ones, the Russian Orthodox Church of Mary Magdalene in Jerusalem. And at Oxford University and Cambridge University, there are colleges named for her, and so on, all over the world. Icons celebrating her, and so on. Here's a Northern European Renaissance engraving of Mary Magdalene. Doesn't look very sinister. The suggestion is that she was turned into a prostitute to undercut her credibility as a leader in the early church. Well, two things might challenge that. Number one, there are some prominent prostitutes in the Bible. Anybody ever heard of Rahab? Rahab is listed in the Epistle to the Hebrews as being a great example of faith. So there is one prostitute who is celebrated in memory. So even if it were true that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute before she met Jesus, that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. All of Jesus' disciples were sinners, and sinners who acknowledged that they were sinners, but called to grace. But in any case, here's a picture, a Western European picture of Mary Magdalene as essentially a young, serious, devout woman studying the Bible. That theory comes from the fact that in the 6th century, the beginning of the 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great preached a sermon in which he identified Mary Magdalene and Mary of Bethany and the sinful woman in the house of Simon the Pharisee as the one and the same person. In the Eastern Church, nobody's ever suggested that. In the Western Church, the tradition started with Gregory the Great simply because probably some research assistant of his who helped him prepare his sermons had heard this story from somebody and sort of put it together, and it sort of passed on into Christian tradition. But there's no sign of any sinister intent to that. There are these other texts that are quoted in the Da Vinci Code that having to do with Mary Magdalene. The Gospel of Thomas is the most famous one that you've heard about. There's 5 Gospels have been published. This is the 5th Gospel. There's a competition between Peter and Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene has a close relationship with Jesus. In the final logion, this Gospel of Thomas is not like the Gospels in the New Testament, which contain historical narrative, but rather it's simply a collection of 114 sayings of Jesus. Some of them you'll recognize from the Gospels in the New Testament. Some of them seem to be a variation of those Gospels with a little strange term or two or strange ideas mixed in, and some seem really weird compared to the other Gospels. But in any case, there's no historical narrative here. There's no crucifixion of Jesus. There's no walking along the roads of Palestine. There's no resurrection. There's no history really at all in this. But in any case, Mary Magdalene is there, as she is in the New Testament, and has a close relationship with Jesus. In the final logion, Peter says to Jesus, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." Jesus responds, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males." Now, that has been suggested by various minority scholars in our time as somehow being a liberating text for women, but it doesn't sound that way to me. The fact is that in the so-called Gnostic Gospels, these 2nd, 3rd, 4th century Gospels that have come out of a sort of heretical group, or at least a marginal group of professed Christians, actually have a mixed view, just like Orthodox Christianity in its inception, as to whether it affirms women or not. The fact is that Gnosticism denies the material world. The material world is essentially evil, and all evil in the world is because of the material world. So Gnosticism is very anti-sexuality, period, male or female. The ideal is a blending, so that you have a human person that really transcends sexuality, that is asexual in effect, and not also immaterial, free once and for all from this human, material, sinful, dirty, created world that we live in. Quite different from anything you read in the New Testament or the Old Testament. These other texts that are quoted in the text, the so-called Gospel of Mary, it comes out of Greek, written early in the 3rd century, found among the Nag Hammadi texts in a 5th century document. Mary shares secret revelations from the Lord. She's resisted by Andrew, ridiculed by Peter, but defended by the Apostle Levi. Peter says, "We know the Lord loved you more than the rest of women." And Levi said, "The Savior loved her more than us." That's basically what you find in this text. Not a lot of material to go on to develop a theory. Another Gnostic text called Pistis Sophia, 3rd century dialogues with Jesus. 39 of the 64 questions of the disciples are asked by Mary Magdalene. She's described as the one in whose heart is directed towards the kingdom more than all of her brothers, superior in every way to all the disciples. And that's about it. Another document is the Dialogue of the Savior, 3rd century document. Mary Magdalene is one of 3 disciples chosen to receive special teaching. She's more significant than Matthew and Thomas because she spoke as a woman who knew the all. Now that's very deliberate Gnostic language. Another document from the late 3rd century, Gospel of Philip, describes Mary Magdalene as a companion of the Lord. Sir Hugh Teboom says companion in Aramaic, that means spouse. Well, this text was originally written in Greek, and it exists in Coptic today. And the word concerned is actually a Greek loanword, koinos, which means simply companion or partner or friend, fellow disciple. It's the word from which we get the word koinonia, Greek word we translate usually fellowship. It said that Christ loved her more than the other disciples, and that she was frequently kissed by Christ. The standard text put in square brackets on the mouth. There's a missing words in the document, and the guess of some scholars is that Jesus kissed her on the mouth. Well, it could have been on the cheek, it could have been on the arm or hand, I don't know, but it's customary in the Middle East today and in certain parts of the world, like in Quebec or in France or Switzerland, where I've lived, in Italy, for men and women who are family and close friends, sometimes disciples in the same Christian community, to kiss one another regularly when they greet. Paul says in the New Testament, greet one another with the holy kiss. We would say, give everybody a hearty handshake. I've seen a picture on the front page of the Seattle Times of the former governor of Iraq, the American governor of Iraq, kissing one of the most prominent ayatollahs in Iraq. There is not one person in Iraq who would look at that picture and say that somehow these two men were having a homosexual display. Not at all. This is just a culturally appropriate way to respond in that context. Another text, the Acts of Philip, which refers to another prominent woman by the name of Mary. Well, there you have all of the evidence for the idea that somehow that Jesus intended Mary Magdalene really to be the leader of his apostolic band. The fact is, there's not much evidence of that, but there is evidence in the New Testament that has been universally recognized by Christians down through the ages that Mary Magdalene was the first witness to the resurrection, and she was a prominent disciple of Jesus. The Eastern Church has never suggested that she was a converted prostitute. The Western Church, since the 6th century, has, but there's no evidence that this was done to somehow denigrate her witness. Early tradition suggests that she went with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the Apostle John to Ephesus, an important city, and that she actually was married to John. That's not a very strong tradition, but it is fairly early. She lived and was buried in Ephesus. There are much later traditions that connect Mary Magdalene as going to France, along with John, Martha, and Lazarus, and a very late tradition of her going with Joseph of Arimathea, who turns out to be the rich uncle of Jesus, and he drops Mary Magdalene and her child, and the child is by Jesus, off in France. Well, the child part is a 20th century tradition. The Mary Magdalene going to France is a late medieval tradition. There's no tradition prior to a book being written in 1970 by a Presbyterian professor at a small college on the East Coast to suggest that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene. The Mormons, some Mormons, believe that Jesus was married to Mary and Martha of Bethany, but as far as I know, that's the only other suggestion prior to 1970 publication of a book by William Phipps. Well, there are allusions, and I think time is going, so I'll just whiz through the rest. There are allusions to connections with the Knights Templars. Now, if you start reading around on the Knights Templars, you realize there's a lot of literature on the Knights Templars, some of it written by scholars, quite reliable, but most of it not. And there's a lot of stuff there. Is there any reason to connect the Knights Templars with this Priory of Sion, which, as far as we know, we can't find any evidence of it existed until the 20th century, and so on, or to somehow feel that they discovered some truth about Christianity and its origin that they were keeping secret, and that's why there was this great attack upon them in the Middle Ages in Europe and so on. No, I'm afraid it's probably not. Joseph of Arimathea, any historical basis for his being the first bishop of England, or one part of England? Not really. And even less evidence for his having dropped Mary Magdalene off in France on his way to England. How about King Arthur and his knights that were looking for the Holy Grail? Is there any evidence to suggest that they were not looking for the cup that was used in the Last Supper, but rather looking for the seed of Jesus, the descendants of Jesus, the chalice of the womb of Mary Magdalene. No, it makes for an interesting read, but there's no real evidence of this. What about Sir Isaac Newton being a leader in this secret society designed to keep the truth about the true origins of Christianity, which seems more pagan than what came out to be Orthodox Christianity? What about Isaac Newton? He sort of gave up his academic career, having made quite a mark on the history of science, to study religion. What was he doing? Well, we have texts of what he is doing. We have his manuscripts. He published books. He was studying the Bible. He became, in effect, a lay theologian and devoted to having made a great mark on science, trying to make a mark on the study of the Bible. No evidence anywhere in the life and documents, writings about, or his own personal writings that he in any way was promoting paganism. Some of the ideas come from a sort of a conspiracy theory, if you will, coming out of between the two world wars and after the Second World War, concerning a little village called Rennes-le-Chateau, and a priest by the name of Father Sonnier, same name as the guy in the novel who's murdered. And the idea was that this poor priest had a lot of money. And somebody suggested it was because he discovered these treasures that included money, but they also included these important documents that told the real story of the origin of Christianity. And that's how he was able, in this very poor place, this poor priest, to build this nice house and to build a nice church and all this sort of thing. As it turns out, the way he got that money was basically advertising in the French newspapers that he would say, this is the days before Vatican II, that he would say a mass for your loved ones who had gone on before. And this became economically very successful. The only problem was he collected a lot more money than he had hours in the day to say those masses. And so he really didn't fulfill it, and he ultimately was defrocked. Not because he had discovered some secret that put Christianity in jeopardy, but rather he was a crook. He was raising money for the church, basically by lying. The Vinci Code seems to suggest that all pagan religions were the same and they are good. Suggests that Ammon and Isis and little baby Horus were related, and that's sort of a confusion of the gods and goddesses in ancient Egypt, and that somehow this really was a fountainhead of some aspects of early Christianity. What about the Dead Sea Scrolls? Professor, or the historian Tebung pontificates, well, there's a lot of information in the Dead Sea Scrolls that demonstrate this to scholars. Well, there's nothing actually in the Dead Sea Scrolls that has anything at all to do directly with Christianity. It has to do with pre-Christian Judaism, and it gives us a lot of information. These scrolls have been mostly, not all yet, published, but they are in the process of being published. Most of them have already been published. You can go read them in translation, and you can see if there's anything there about the eternal feminine or the true origins of Christianity, and scholars simply laugh and say there's nothing there. What about Roslin Chapel, this strange chapel outside of Edinburgh? Well, they've got a problem now because they have to let people in. There's so many people who want to visit this place, and again, most of them with copies of the Da Vinci Code under their arm. So the fabric is being destroyed by all the people breathing and moving through the building, and all following out the suggestions of the Da Vinci Code. It's a weird building, I tell you. It has a lot of weird symbols and so on, but no evidence that Mary Magdalene was once buried there, or that it was the center of this particular cult. Well, where did Dan Brown get his ideas? Basically these two books, several others. He has a website in which he lists about 30 titles, only a few of them by recognized academics, but probably 80% of his theory comes from this book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, by 3 journalists. 2 of these journalists actually have tried to sue Dan Brown. I don't know if the suit is still pending. And they really should be giving him a commission on the royalties of their book, because their book had sort of settled down to selling 400 or 500 copies a year until the Da Vinci Code came out. Now they've been on bestseller lists in recent years as well as a result of Dan Brown's. But anyway, his historical research is essentially related to these 2 books and to a handful of others, none of which would be recognized by professors of history at University of California, for example. Theological assumption. What I mean, Thieben countered, is that almost everything our fathers taught us about Christ is false, as are the stories about the Holy Grail. Every faith in the world, says Langdon, is based on fabrication. These are sort of the assumptions. Well, another assumption, history since the beginning of recorded time has been written by the winners. Well, if you really believe that, you would probably agree with Henry Ford in that history is bunk, or at least you would be totally skeptical, but I don't really believe that. Is there some evidence in the Nag Hammadi text? Well, I've sort of highlighted all the evidence that there is there, and it didn't sound like to me there was any evidence for the original pagan origin of Christianity as something quite different from what it's turned out to be. Contrast the New Testament Gospels with the so-called Gnostic Gospels. The basic differences are the Gnostic Gospels have no historical context. In the Creed, it says Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Jesus is not crucified in the Gnostic traditions because he wasn't really a human being. He was a spirit. And because he's a spirit, we too can escape from the physical realm because he came to show us the way. So there's no historical context, and salvation is not by his death, burial, and resurrection, but rather by esoteric knowledge. Hence, we call it Gnosticism. Greek is gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge. Salvation by religious secret knowledge, so to speak. Well, why do people believe that a lot of this is more than just a novel, that all of these references to history really are factual? Well, this is what is claimed in the front of the book. I have already noted that these so-called secret documents were actually forgeries placed there, and again, you can document that. You don't have to just take my text. The whole idea of the Priory of Sion going back to the 11th century is unhistorical. He says all descriptions of artwork, architecture, documents, and secret rituals in the novel are accurate. Are they? Occasionally they are. Occasionally. And he could have been more accurate, but the fact is maybe 80% of the occasion, even in terms of some of these details, he really gets it wrong. The idea that Constantine, the first Christian emperor, and his male successors converted the world from matriarchal paganism to patriarchal Christianity by waging a campaign of conquest, and that somehow Constantine was responsible for producing the Nicene Creed. Up to that time, Jesus was just a really nice man who had wonderful words of wisdom about how you should live and love and so on. And then all of a sudden, overnight, the Council of Nicaea declares that he is God. Well, I'm afraid the question was not really discussed. The question at Nicaea was, what does it mean to say what all Christians believed up to that time, and believed from the first century, and there's lots of documentary evidence for that, to say that Jesus is God? What does that really mean? There were 2 basic groups. One, that it meant that he was really equal with the Father and also the Holy Spirit, that the doctrine that we would call the doctrine of the Trinity, three persons in one being, one Godhead. The second group was led by a man named Arius, who argued that Jesus was God, but he was sort of the highest of the created God. So next to the eternal God, Jesus is sort of next in line. He is the instrument who is sent by the Father to bring salvation, but he's not really equal with the Father. The book says that there was a very close vote at the council. Well, the actual vote on that issue was something like about 327 to about 4 or 5. It wasn't very close, and it wasn't the issue voted on. Reference to the Inquisition, that you've heard this probably, and I've heard people say there were 30 or 40 million women in the Middle Ages condemned as witches. Scholars will tell you that it's probably more like 20 or 30,000, and many of the witches happen to be men. In Switzerland, I am told that there were actually many more men that were accused of being witches and were killed. But the second thing, they weren't killed generally by the church. They were killed by the state, even though the church colluded in this very often. Now, I don't think it's a good idea to kill anybody who, even if they were a real witch, it's not a good idea. But so it was a terrible thing, but this is more than a little exaggerated. Tarot cards, that's a very interesting thing. According to Langdon, talking to Sophie, originally tarot had been devised as a secret means to pass along ideologies banned by the church, to keep the truth. Well, is that true? Actually, tarot cards seem to have come out as a game similar to a lot of card games that we have today. First, it was basically a wordless picture book to tell stories to children of very wealthy Italians. And about 3 centuries later, somebody took some of those pictures and adapted them into playing cards. And it became sort of a parlor game. And eventually, some 3 centuries after that, gypsy fortune tellers developed them into a system of telling your fortune. And there are at least 4 major traditions in what these cards mean, and none of them is anything like what is suggested by the Da Vinci Code. We've already indicated that the pentagram or pentacle is not always a symbol for Satan or paganism, but it has other histories. What can we learn from the Da Vinci Code? One is that more people are interested in reading literature or looking at art than in reading theology or even history, and certainly in our culture. The power of literature and art to communicate. So if you're going to make a living writing, go into fiction and do it well. Secondly is the presence of images and symbols in our culture. Very often, many Protestant churches have been moved far away from the use of symbols, even in oral preaching and in music and so on. But images and symbols are very powerful and very, very important in a culture. And so Dan Brown is right in calling our attention to the meaning of these symbols, even if he gets most of them wrong. Thirdly, there's a need to read and think critically, and I suppose the most pressing need, I think, in our educational system today, starting in grade school but continuing through university, is to teach people to think critically. When our daughter was young and growing up, we used to say, when we didn't ban television, but we said, look, don't believe anything that you see on television. They're lying to you, generally. Occasionally, maybe. But it's generally a false. Be prepared. Show it, laugh, and so on, but take it with a whole cup of salt. We need to say that about everything. I hear people just so excited about the internet and all this wonderful information. Allegedly, knowledge is doubling every 2 or 3 years. Well, maybe data is, wisdom isn't, truth isn't, accurate knowledge certainly isn't. We need to teach people. I've had students in various places I've taught have picked up bogus information on the internet, have woven it into the papers they've written, and claimed it for themselves. Well, I too can Google and find those sources, and I would like my students to be a little more critical in their use of these things. Also learn how to write footnotes and so on. Finally, there's the importance of historical research and understanding. America has a poor rate of even traditional literacy. I think it's something pushing 8 or 9% of the people who live in the United States are totally literal. That is, they cannot read or write. I would guess that 90% of the people who live in the United States, and it would be true of many other countries, not just the United States, are historically illiterate. And the reason something like the Da Vinci Code, in terms of its historical allusions, is so attractive is because people don't know anything about history. They have only heard of Constantine, or maybe they haven't. The Nicene Creed, what's that? Even Christians haven't heard of the Nicene Creed in many cases. And so on. Leonardo in 16th century Florence and Milan and in Amboise. Where is that? I read somewhere that 35% of adult Americans can't find the United States on a map. And so on. Now, I do this not to belittle Americans, but to say that we have tended to lose an understanding of history and a knowledge of history, even our own short history, but much less other history. And so this is very important. And finally, this is important. It underlines, a study of this underlines the difference between Christianity and Gnostic religion. Now, I would like to end with an affirmation. Dan Brown's book may not win the Nobel Prize. It will not get a Pulitzer and probably won't win any other prizes other than those offered by the book publishing industry or some Wall Street Journal maybe for financial success. But it was a really fun read. And I stayed up late 2 nights to finish it and I've enjoyed rereading it and so on. So as fiction, terrific. Good is, well, better than most anything on television. It's a super script for a movie. And I am sure, I'm looking forward to seeing the movie. But ladies and gentlemen, it is fiction. And whatever Dan Brown himself believes, it's not really history or fact. I conclude simply with a saying from G.K. Chesterton, one of the most popular writers and public speakers of his day. And I conclude with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gasque. We're going to move into a time of Q&A, so if there are any questions that you'd like to ask Dr. Gasque about any of the material that he shared tonight, or any questions that you have about the book, there are 2 microphones up here. We just ask that you limit it to 1 question, keep it brief, and make sure that it's something that requires an actual answer. So it's a question, not a statement. So we'll go into that time of Q&A and come on up.
And please come to the microphones to do that so everybody can hear, please.
And also speak into the mic because this is being recorded.
I don't personally object if you want to make a response either, so it doesn't have to be a question. I'm willing to respond, but if you have any questions as to any details that I didn't cover or that you'd like covered, go. Who'll be first before there's a lineup? 2 microphones on either aisle. Thank you. Yes.
How long ago have you read this book?
I read it about, I keep reading it, but I've read it about a year and a half ago, the first time. It'd been out about 7 months when I first read it. And I've been through the illustrated edition and looked at all the pictures and that, so on. Academics, I generally don't read this kind of literature, and I've tried to persuade a lot of my colleagues, historians, philosophers, biblical scholars, to actually read it and say something about it, and their general response is, oh, just not going to waste my time on this. Well, you might have fun too, but in any case, I think it's important enough to respond to, because when it's all over, there are going to be about probably 300-400 million people have read this book. So it seems to me that any academic who's involved in historical research or religious studies or theology, something like this, ought to have an opinion and ought to give one on it. And so that's been what I've been willing to do. Anybody else? They did a survey recently in Canada, the IPOS Read group, which is sort of the equivalent in Canada of the Gallup poll, and they determined that something like 40% of all people who have read the book in Canada believe that the historical claims are true, the insinuations of the historical background. That's 1.4 million people in Canada. Translate that into the United States, which is 10 times bigger, you know, there's 13 or 14 million Americans who presumably read it, who believe that too. Yes?
Following up on that last comment, then what would be your reasonings why so many people bought into it when it's on as a fiction book on all lists? It doesn't say it's nonfiction.
Yes, it's very interesting that his book, Angels and Demons, which is at least as exciting but even less plausible, and the reason it's less plausible to us because it's more contemporary. Nobody believes, he says the same thing at the beginning of Angels and Demons, and nobody believes it, that he really believes that or that there's anything to it. But with the Da Vinci Code, they do. I think it's because there are millions of people who have read it, who were brought up as some type of Christians, whether nominal or real, and somewhere along the line, like many fellow Americans, and this is true in other parts of the world, they've sort of stopped going to church, but they didn't make a decision to leave. They just sort of drifted away, and they haven't thought about why. And they read this book and they say, now I understand. The light goes on. It's because it's a fraud. I knew there was a reason. I stopped. Now I think that for some people, I think that is the reason, but that's just a guess. Anybody else? Yep. There's somebody was coming.
Whoa, it's loud. Are you discounting, you spoke on the Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and they claim they did extensive research on the topic of Mary Magdalene and the whole search of the Holy Grail, Knights Templar and all that stuff. Are you discounting their research, or are you discounting the points they make by counterpointing them?
Yeah, I'm discounting the research. I'm discounting the credentials of the people that wrote the book. They have been in detail by detail refuted. It was originally, the book was written in 1982. It became it was accompanied by a television program on the BBC. It became very popular, and then the BBC did 3 or 4 other television documentaries where scholars debunked it point by point, and then it sort of became marginalized, disappeared from public view until the Da Vinci Code came along. Now it's back in public view and people are reading it and so on. But you can't find any review by any historian, and I won't just use some sort of term like reputable historian. Let's say any tenured professor of history at any university in the United States or Canada who would say that Holy Blood, Holy Grail had any degree of validity on any of the points contained in it. It is a fraud. It is, now, they may sue me for saying that, as they've been trying to sue Dan Brown, but you just can't find. So it's incredible. So it's not just in the whole. I mean, it's not just in a general way or a few points. It's just not valid historical research. Yes.
It was recently, I think about 2-3 months ago, I read in the Los Angeles Times that the Vatican had promoted not reading this book. If, I guess, it's so factually inaccurate and
not significant. Why would the Vatican go out of their way to, I guess, make this claim?
Yeah, it wasn't really the Vatican, but it was some bishops in the Vatican. Well, because the Vatican would say there are certain movies that are blasphemous. I'm not a Catholic, which brings another point, another weakness of this book. I'm not a Catholic at all, but there is a tradition in Catholic Church and in Protestant churches of believing that some things are morally harmful, and this book, they would believe, or some would believe, not all Catholics believe that way, would think that it's just morally and objectionable, that's making fun or perverting the Catholic faith. Now, I don't take that view. I think people ought to read it, and they ought to think through things, but there's no evidence that the present Pope, the new Pope, happens to be a world-class historian, and he's an expert in these texts. So there's nobody, and many Catholic scholars are leading historians, so they're not afraid that something's going to be covered, but it's just, they don't like people making fun of their faith. You know, if the same story were told, and it was not it's not the Catholic Church, but it was the elders of Zion who were keeping these secrets, you know, it'd be obvious. Everybody, not only Jews, would be outraged. The implication is that the Catholic Church is deliberately deceiving the world. Now, I read a lot of stuff that I don't agree with, even academic stuff, but I don't take that stance. But that's why they were concerned. By the way, one of the weaknesses of the book, of course, is that the only type of religion, the only type of Christianity that Dan Brown seems to be aware of, at least in the book, is Catholic Christianity. Now, most of the early Christianity took place in the East. So if anybody was hiding anything, it would be the Orthodox, the Eastern Church, because they really dominated early Christianity, and they're the ones that kept all the traditions for the earliest of Christianity, because Christianity took place mainly in what we call today the Near East, and as far as just the edge of the West, and the West developed later. Or if there really was a secret there, you know, they're Protestants, and they've attacked the Catholic Church lots of times. So if this was really true, there are lots of Protestants that like to expose this as much as anybody else. Or there are a lot of secular historians who teach in departments of religious studies, and they're not promoting any form of religion or anything. They read these documents and so on, and you won't find any of them supporting the insinuations here either. Now, I don't know when he originally wrote the book if Dan Brown really intended that people would really be taken in. You know, it's sort of like science fiction. You don't have to believe it. I wasn't. But I don't know if he intended it. But in any case, that's the way it works out. It's very interesting. They are historical documents. If you've heard at all of my mind is blank at the moment, but one of the sort of Rosicrucians, you know, the Rosicrucian myth, the group, there are several thousand, at least Rosicrucians in the world today, maybe 10,000 or so. They have a world headquarters here in California, somewhere, I think, north from here, and so on. The basic background of the Rosicrucian faith comes out of a novel written by an evangelical Protestant pastor as a satire. And it sort of developed as a myth, and it's floating around. 30 years later, the author of the novel said, "Hey, this was a joke. I wrote a satire. Now some people believe this is history." I predict that will happen to the Da Vinci Code. It won't happen soon, but within a generation or two, there will be people claiming that this is pure history, not just alluding to history, simply because people don't have much sense of history.
Do you know why Dan Brown decided to make the Catholic Church kind of the enemy of all his books?
Yeah, I mean, like.
Yeah, I just think, you know, it's a novel. You know, it's an easy way to do it. I mean, there's an awful lot of things that you can't include in a narrative. You know, if you really were more nuanced, you know, you got to explain all this, and that distracts people from the main point. In the Protestant tradition, in the evangelical Protestant tradition that many of you in this audience probably come from, there's been a temptation, or tradition, shall we say, to think that the Catholic Church is dangerous and it's keeping secrets and trying to really keep the gospel from the world and so on. And so certain Protestants might be inclined to think this way. Now, I've found Protestants who have read this book and they first respond and say, whoa, maybe there's something to this. I can believe this about the Catholic Church, but then when they think about it, they say, well, if this is true, then we're all in trouble. But I think that it's just probably literary. I don't know that he's particularly anti-Catholic as such. Just like I said, I ultimately doubt that he really does believe these things. But he probably doesn't want to hurt the sales by saying so. Okay. Oh, okay. One more person. Yes.
Are there any conspiracies out there that you do believe?
Say that again. Any conspiracy that I believe?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, as Malcolm Muggeridge, the journalist, once said, I find when I get up in the morning, before I have breakfast, I have already believed about 7 things I know to be false. So I suppose there might be, but if I thought they were conspiracies that forced upon me, I'd like to challenge them. I think probably in our culture there are lots of conspiracies that we really are taken in of, having to do with money and things and so on, the marketing of things. And some of us believe that we really can't live without this. I remember seeing on television recently someone talking about the latest medical technology. And you had these little mechanical pills that you swallow, and they're going to go through your body, and they will take pictures of all your insides and find out what's wrong with you, and maybe even correct the damage along the way, and so on. And I said to myself, you know, there are 2 billion people in the world that live on less than $2 a day, and the majority of the world's population not only doesn't have a cell phone or a computer, doesn't even have access to a phone, and so on. So, yeah, I think there's probably a conspiracy to blind us about the real nature of the world, and people in the world that don't have very much, and we really should, or encouraged to focus on accumulating a lot of stuff. So it may not sound, it's not a religious conspiracy, but maybe it is. Thank you.
Thanks again, Dr. Gasque.